So what you have is a situation, and maybe next the kind of big phase before we could try to weave some things together here, because I would think the Moynihan report is really important in this. This is one of the most interesting reads of the Moynihan report I've ever seen. But that this dynamic of, and again, you do a very good job of specifying the distinction between social and cultural attitudes of racism and formal legal discrimination as legal and political, again, literal discrimination, as conflated with conversations about poverty and deindustrialization, which are connected but not the same thing. And then you start to really unravel it, and you sort of show that there is very much, and I guess it makes sense if from the perspective of our politics, but some people would find it counterintuitive, that that basically the same people in the 80s and 90s say that were, lecturing poor Black people, or Barack Obama certainly did plenty of that as well, which you could talk about. And people who were very focused and would be rejected now because it's just, embarrassing stuff of, cultures of poverty and the specific reasons, like why is it that the inner city has all of these problems? Well, obviously it's not because of macroeconomic policy. It's because, LL Cool J is not cultivating a work ethic through the records or whatever other just mega nonsense of blaming the poor and coming up with these racialized narratives. But then that conversely, the move now, though, of mystifying it, that no, it can't just be that every single human being in the country needs healthcare, that every single person needs a high-paying union job, that every single person needs public good in the forms of universities and libraries and so on. And that if you systemically weed out that you basically starve all of those things over the last several decades, that it's going to have serious consequences on deindustrialized areas, that no, it needs to be something more mystical or specific than that. And so that in a way, the sort of like racist blame the poor and blame like culture of poverty stuff. And then on the other hand, no, none of this can be addressed by like real policy interventions because it exists as a metaphysical force outside of political and material history. They actually start to meet at a kind of just cultural nexus where you can argue, but certainly nothing can like actually happen.
Yeah, you'll have to direct me to the question.
I know. I'm just trying, my thing is I'm trying to put this together because you put so much, but like, I guess in the Moynihan report, you say that a lot of that he's been attacked for developing very racialized culture of poverty ideas, but you sort of trace, if I'm reading you right, that into that some of the people who would sort of attack it on those grounds are basically doing the same thing.
Yeah.
In their own words.
Well, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
No, don't go.
Okay. There's a tendency to discuss the Moynihan report, really in terms of his sexism, which is definitely worth discussing, right? I mean, he certainly embraced some vision of patriarchy. There's a tendency, I think, to criticize the Moynihan report for its insensitivity. And, maybe the language of the Moynihan report is kind of creepy. And maybe the language in some of his other subsequent essays is kind of creepy. But it's worse than that. One of the points that I make about Moynihan is that he is an ethnic pluralist. And fundamentally what that means, if one knows what ethnic pluralism is, and one may not, but if one knows what that meant in the 1960s, is that Moynihan was, I think, reasonably understood as a racist in the true sense of the word. There's no question that Moynihan had the best interest of Black people at heart as he saw it. It's the as he saw it that's the star of the show, though, right? Because again, he clearly meant well, I think, and there's no doubt in my mind about the sincerity of his commitment to doing right by Black people. But while he did reference the value of jobs, that was a kind of fleeting reference. Value of jobs to redressing the crisis of the Black family and Black poverty as well. Instead, what he was most interested in was, as a good ethnic pluralist would be, buttressing the institutions of social control, the family, and cultural tutelage for poor Blacks. What he wasn't so interested in was examining the sources, the material sources of poverty. He took the commercial Keynesian model of growth politics as a given. And again, he absolutely in the 1960s and later discussed the value of jobs. But for the hardcore unemployed, for the Black underclass, as they would eventually be known, he wasn't convinced that jobs alone would satisfy the problems that were or would redress the problems that were afflicting, central cities. Instead, sending Black men to Vietnam might have been in order where they would learn to be, well, he didn't say send them to Vietnam, but he did say send them to the military. And it's clear that Robert McNamara was influenced by Moynihan when McNamara had signed off on Project 100,000, which lowered the Army entrance exams to swell the ranks of troops who would be deployed to Vietnam, which is why Forrest Gump was deployed, presumably, to Vietnam, and that horribly.
He had a good work ethic, though.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
So the culture of poverty narrative ends up trumping any sort of political economic, interpretation of Black poverty. And one of the points that I make is that helps to buttress the Johnson administration's, the culture of poverty narrative helps to buttress the Johnson administration's anemic war on poverty. In much the same way we would find the Clinton administration would draw on culture of poverty, underclass narratives to co-sign, I don't know, the Omnibus Crime Act or welfare reform or Hope 6, or Obama would admonish Black people around the globe, be they in America or Africa, for the chips on their shoulders or their cultural deficiencies, to basically gloss over what was really the material origin of the deprivation and the disparities that we're left with today.
So, and I was sorry I'm rambling earlier, but this is so important that these programs that get falsely conflated with the universalist programs that Sanders was putting forward or you're putting forward, they get attacked, and by extension, Sanders, but they get attacked for not focusing specifically enough on the supposed specific problems of Black poverty. And your point is that actually going back to Moynihan and back to Johnson, that sort of faulty shift from the overall changes in the economy, that already was starting to happen. And that was the sort of origin point of basically what would end up, because even comparing Johnson to Clinton, let's have some gradation here. Johnson, it's totally anemic, insufficient, and paternalistic. But by the time you get to Clinton, this rhetoric of an underclass that needs to be morally developed is just being used to warehouse people in prisons and completely gut the welfare state in a way that, in the best of economic circumstances, just sort of herds people into, the new temp sector or no jobs at all.
Yeah, no. And I like Johnson, partly because I was born in the 70s. I would probably feel a little differently if I were my dad's age, let's say.
I think so.
That said, I now, in retrospect, thanks to you, feel bad about that comparison, but of Johnson and Clinton. But yeah, the part of the point that I'm making is that Moynihan specifically was invested in something that we would call today structural racism. The Johnson administration was invested in something that we would call structural racism. That came in two forms. For at least the Johnson administration, the investment came in two basic forms. Programs that centered on cultural tutelage for the hardcore unemployed who, parens black, hardcore black unemployed, and of course, anti-discrimination policies. But what those policies, and I would say the anti-discrimination policies were very important, right? The anti-discrimination policies, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 opens employment opportunities to black white collar professionals, but even a stratum of black blue collar workers, right? I mean, you get an explosion by the 70s anyway, in the number of black police officers and the number of black firemen. And I bet there's an increase in the number of black electricians and carpenters as well, right? So it did certainly open opportunities for a stratum of employed or gainfully employed black Americans. In the long arc, though, anti-discrimination policy would in many ways be more beneficial to black white-collar professionals and of course, female white-collar professionals, can't forget them, insofar as the economy continued to move away from blue-collar manufacturing to white-collar service, right? So we've got that. The cultural tutelage piece, though, is often, is worth considering because it offers a window onto the conservatism of the anti-poverty, agenda of that era. Because once again, along with the, emphasis on anti-discrimination policy, the cultural tutelage piece is a kind of targeted initiative or a set of targeted initiatives. Like Job Corps is going to be part of that, right? And Vista is going to be a part of this. Community action programs are going to be a part of that. And again, that focus on race, and that's what this is. It's a focus on race and it's a focus on racism that we get out of the Johnson administration and subsequent liberal administrations will have some benefits. The anti-discrimination policies will have benefits. I should have also stressed that the Civil Rights Act of 1968 opens up home ownership to blacks, right? So that's super important. I wouldn't be a homeowner, nor would my parents have been homeowners were it not for it. So great. But nevertheless, there is a structural shift that's taking place in the US economy that goes back to the 1950s, that these policies that focus on race, abstracted from political economy, they are intended to redress disparities, but casting a blind eye to the disproportionate impact of deindustrialization on blacks, these policies prove to be inadequate. And you're right, and I'm glad you stressed this point, that many progressives even, certainly Democrats and a host of cultural nationalists, conflate these targeted programs that we get out of the Johnson administration with universal programs. The New Deal was problematic. There's no question that the New Deal was inadequate. There's no question that blacks did not share equally in the benefits of the New Deal with whites. The problem with the New Deal was that its universal programs weren't actually universal because they did often enough, administered from the state and local level, they did often enough, they were hobbled by discrimination, right, and administration. And in the case of the FHA, it was built in. But that's not a case against universal programs. That's a case against universal programs that aren't actually universal. And the Johnson administration eschewed universal programs in favor of targeted programs. And the New Deal policies and the war on poverty policies are conflated, right? So,
and as I'm reading you, I mean, Adolph Reed and Baird Rustin are basically saying the whole time, we need to completely get rid of the legal barriers to full equity in this country, have, and things like affirmative action, which you also point out was initially very economically framed and then kind of it turns into a very different discourse. But that, you need to say there's no legal discrimination in any area of life, period. And then as an extension and connected to that, universal programs need to be universal for everybody. And that is and that's a very clear trajectory. And then there's this other culturalist discourse, which either manifests itself most toxically and viciously on the right. We're going to lecture people. We're going to demonize the poor. We're going to come up with all sorts of essentialist racist narratives to justify economic disparity and all the other forms of abuse. Or we might come up with a narrative that is on its face seems much more provocative and radical and deeper, but is kind of doing the same thing, because it's just saying, we can't necessarily sit down here and really think about the economics of it. We just have to kind of reflect on like the deep metaphysical curse of America.
Right.
And then, where does that leave us?
Right. And it's creepy, right? I mean, I think that's, calling it creepy is an understatement. But when we look at the tendency of many of us to just reflexively refer to racism as our original sin, or racism being in our DNA, right? Hillary Clinton had described racism as being in our DNA going back.
It's in my producer's DNA, not mine. Just to be
right?
clear. Stay muted. Don't deny it. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
If we tease out that metaphor, well, how do you fix that, right? You're stuck with original sin. You're stuck with your DNA that just kind of is what it is. And the reflexive way that people fall back on this, it's shades of 100 years ago, or some version of the sci-fi channel's The Devil Made Me Do It, right? I mean, if it's in your DNA, then you can't really be held responsible for it. Racism is not is not the expression of ideological commitments, right? It's just something that's inborn, which would make race and racism the only ideology that you're born with. All other ideologies move with time. All other cultural expressions of those ideologies move with time, right? And can go away. But when we talk about racism, again, as an original sin or DNA, then that implies that we're stuck with it forever. And if the problems of disparities are about racism that we're stuck with forever, then there's no way to actually fix that.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.